The wind carried secrets across the Wyoming hills that autumn morning in 1887. It whispered through the yellowing grass and rattled the wooden crosses in the small cemetery that crowned the eastern ridge of Blackstone Ranch. The sky hung heavy with clouds, the color of old bruises threatening rain that would not come for hours yet. In that suspended moment between dawn and daylight, a solitary figure stood before a granite headstone, his broad shoulders bowed beneath the weight of 3 years' grief. Silas Blackstone had not cried at his father's funeral. He had not cried in the weeks that followed, when creditors came like vultures to pick at the bones of everything Jonathan Blackstone had built. He had not cried when Eleanor Morrison, the woman he had loved with the fierce devotion of youth, had called him a fool and left him standing in the parlor of the ranch house with a ring in his hand and ashes in his mouth. But now, alone with the dead and the rising wind, he felt something crack open in his chest. The headstone was simple. Jonathan Blackstone, 1832 to 1884. Betrayed, but not broken. Silas had chosen those words himself, carving them into stone the way his father's death had carved them into his heart. His hand trembled as he placed a yellowed envelope on the grave, the paper spotted with age and brittle with the passage of years. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. He spoke so rarely these days that the sound of his own words sometimes startled him. "I found out who he was, Pa." The wind took his confession and scattered it across the hills. "William Hartley's daughter is coming here tomorrow, and she doesn't know I know." A magpie called from the fence line, harsh and mocking. Silas closed his eyes and saw it all again as he had seen it 1,000 times before. His father in the study, gray-faced and shaking, holding the bank statements that proved what everyone had suspected. William Hartley had taken everything. The investment in the cattle futures, the expansion of the southern pastures, the new breeding program that was supposed to secure the ranch's future for generations. All of it gone siphoned away through a series of transactions so complex that by the time Jonathan understood what had happened, William Hartley had vanished like smoke. 3 months later, Jonathan Blackstone was dead. The doctor called it heart failure. Silas knew better. His father had died of betrayal, of the particular poison that comes from trusting the wrong person with everything you have built. And now the dead man's daughter was coming to his ranch. Silas opened his eyes and looked out across the land his father had loved. The ranch sprawled beneath the troubled sky fence lines, running like veins through the body of the earth. Cattle moved in the distance, dark shapes against darker hills. The barn needed paint. The eastern fence sagged in 3 places. The whole enterprise had the look of something slowly dying, and Silas knew he was killing it through sheer force of will, working himself to exhaustion each day so he would be too tired to remember what it felt like to hope. "I don't know what she wants," he said to the stone, "but I'm going to find out." He turned and walked back down the hill. Behind him, the envelope lifted in a gust of wind and tumbled across the grass, coming to rest against the base of the headstone where the earth was still dark from yesterday's rain. The morning Josephine Hartley arrived, the sky had cleared to a blue so deep it looked like you could fall into it forever. She rode through the gates of Blackstone Ranch on a dappled mare that had seen better days, her hat pulled low to shade her eyes from the climbing sun. Dust rose in small clouds beneath the horses' hooves, hanging in the still air like questions. She had practiced this moment. In the long nights at the boarding house in Cheyenne, lying awake while other women slept, she had rehearsed what she would say, how she would stand the expression she would wear on her face. Confident but not arrogant, capable but not threatening, a woman looking for honest work, nothing more. The lies came easier than she had expected. The ranch spread before her like a kingdom in decline. She saw it all with the practiced eye of someone who had worked on ranches since childhood. The sagging fences spoke of neglect, but the land itself was good. The barn needed attention, but the structure was sound. The cattle in the distant fields looked lean but healthy. This was not a dying ranch. This was a ranch waiting for someone to care again. She had not expected the man who emerged from the barn to take her breath away. Silas Blackstone stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad from years of labor that broke other men. His dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that caught the light, and when he pushed it back impatiently, she saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a hard face carved by grief and weather into something that might have been handsome once, but now carried the weight of too much silence. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and turbulent, and looking at her with an expression that made her heart kick against her ribs. He said nothing, just studied her with those terrible eyes, while the seconds stretched into something that felt like judgment. Josephine had survived worse than silence. At 25, she had already lived a lifetime of loss. She had worked ranches where men twice her size refused to speak to her for weeks, trying to drive her away through sheer force of contempt. She had gentled horses that had been beaten until they trusted nothing. She had buried her father with dirt under her fingernails and debt collectors at her back. She would not be intimidated by a man who looked at her like he was trying to see through her skin to the secrets beneath. She dismounted with practiced grace and extended her hand. "Josephine Hartley, I'm here about the horse training position." The lie tasted like copper on her tongue. He looked at her hand as though he had forgotten what the gesture meant. Then slowly he took it. His palm was rough with calluses warm against her skin. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that she existed in a way he could not ignore. Silas Blackstone. His voice was low and roughened from disuse, each word chosen carefully, as if speech cost him something precious. The position requires handling difficult animals, dangerous ones. Josephine met his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. There was something in the way he looked at her. Not suspicion exactly, something deeper, something that felt like he was waiting for her to reveal herself. "I've handled difficult things my whole life, Mr. Blackstone. I imagine your horses will be no exception." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to make her wonder what his face might look like if he ever truly smiled again. "Come with me." He led her behind the barn to a paddock that had seen recent repairs. The fence posts were new, the rails still showing saw marks. In the center of the enclosure, a magnificent black stallion paced with restless energy. The horse's coat gleamed like polished obsidian muscles, rippling beneath skin that looked almost liquid in the morning light. He was beautiful and clearly volatile, throwing his head and snorting as they approached. "This is Tempest." Silas leaned against the fence, arms crossed over his chest. The gesture might have looked casual, if not for the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when the horse wheeled and kicked at nothing. "3 trainers have tried to break him. 2 left with broken bones, the 3rd just left." Josephine studied the animal with eyes that had learned to see past surface to substance. The horse was not wild. He was wounded. She could see it in the way he held his head too high, the constant tension in his body, the fear that masqueraded as aggression. Someone had hurt this horse. Someone had taught him that humans meant pain. "He doesn't need to be broken." Her voice came out softer than she intended, carrying a sadness she had not meant to reveal. "He needs to be understood." Silas turned to look at her then, and for the first time genuine interest sparked in those storm-gray eyes. "You think you can understand him?" She met his gaze and felt something pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared damage, of hearts that had learned to protect themselves through walls and distance, of the terrible cost of staying safe. "I think anyone can be understood if someone takes the time to listen." The words hung between them, meaning more than they should. She was talking about the horse. They both knew she was talking about something else entirely. That evening, Josephine took her belongings to the small room above the kitchen that Margaret Thorne, the ranch's cook and housekeeper, had prepared for her. The room was simple. A bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out over the southern pastures. It smelled of lye soap and sun-dried linen. Clean. Honest. Nothing like the boarding houses she had stayed in over the past 2 years, where the walls were thin and the locks were broken, and you learned to sleep with one hand on your knife. Margaret had watched her with sharp brown eyes all through dinner, saying little but missing nothing. The woman was close to 50, her hair more gray than brown, her body solid from decades of hard work. She moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of her domain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority. "You're the first woman Silas has hired in 3 years." It was not quite a question. Josephine set down her fork carefully. "That's so. Strange, isn't it, a man who never hires women, and never this fast?" Margaret's eyes held hers, searching for something. Josephine felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. Maybe he just needs the help. Maybe. Margaret turned back to the stove, but Josephine could feel the weight of suspicion settling over the kitchen like dust. She would have to be more careful. One slip, one wrong word, and Margaret would see through her. And if Margaret saw through her, how long before Silas did, if he had not already? The thought sent ice through her veins. She remembered the way he had looked at her that morning. Not like a stranger, like someone examining a puzzle waiting to see if the pieces would fit the way he expected. That night, she could not sleep. The moon rose full and bright, painting the world in shades of silver and shadow. Through her window she could see the paddock where Tempest paced endlessly, a dark shape moving against darker earth. The horse had not rested since morning, had not eaten, had not allowed himself to be vulnerable even for a moment. She understood that impulse more than she wanted to admit. At midnight she gave up on sleep and dressed quietly. The ranch was silent as she slipped out of the house and made her way to the barn. The air smelled of hay and horse and the particular sweetness of autumn nights. Inside the barn, she found a lantern and lit it carefully, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and low. Tempest heard her coming. She could hear him snorting, stamping his hooves, striking the paddock fence. When she reached the enclosure, he was pressed against the far rails, head high, eyes rolling white in the moonlight. "Easy now," she kept her voice soft, melodic, the way her father had taught her. Not William Hartley, her real father, the man who had died when she was 4, leaving her mother alone and desperate. The man whose name she barely remembered, but whose hands had been gentle when he lifted her onto her first pony. William Hartley had come later, had married her mother and given them a home, had taught Josephine everything he knew about horses and ranching and the hard business of survival. And then he had betrayed the Blackstones and disappeared, leaving Josephine with nothing but his name and his debts and the crushing weight of his sins. "I know what it's like to be afraid." She climbed onto the fence and sat letting her legs dangle, making no move to approach the horse. "I know what it's like to think the whole world wants to hurt you." Tempest circled the paddock, never taking his eyes off her. His breath came in harsh snorts that clouded in the cooling air. But not everyone is cruel, not everyone is dangerous. She pulled a small book from her pocket, poetry, the same slim volume she had carried since childhood, its pages soft from countless readings. She opened it at random and began to read aloud, not trying to reach the horse, just existing in his space, letting him grow accustomed to the sound of her voice, the shape of her presence. She did not hear Silas approach, did not know he was there until his voice cut through the darkness, making her jump. "What are you doing?" She turned to find him standing just outside the circle of lantern light, his face half in shadow. He wore only a shirt and trousers, his feet bare on the dusty ground. He must have seen her leave the house, must have followed her here. "I couldn't sleep." "So you decided to risk your life with a horse that's already put 2 men in the hospital?" There was something in his voice, not quite anger, something colder and more controlled. Josephine climbed down from the fence, tucking the book back into her pocket. "He's not dangerous. He's scared. You've known him one day, and you think you understand him better than men who've worked with horses their whole lives." "Understanding doesn't take time, Mr. Blackstone. It takes attention." She started to walk past him, but his hand shot out and caught her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to stop her, firmly enough to make her pulse spike with something that was not entirely fear. "You have no right to touch that horse." His face was close to hers now. Close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the scent of pine soap and something darker beneath. His grip on her arm was warm, almost burning through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "He's suffering," she said quietly. "Can't you see he needs healing, not isolation? And you think you're the one to heal him?" The question held layers she did not want to examine. She pulled her arm free gently, carefully, not making it a fight. Anyone who's been hurt deserves a chance to trust again. They stood there in the moonlight, two wounded people circling each other like Tempest circled his paddock, looking for weakness, looking for danger, looking for something neither of them could name. Finally, Silas stepped back. "Stay away from that horse at night. You work during daylight hours only. Understood? Understood." She walked back to the house without looking back, but she could feel his eyes on her every step of the way. That night, she did not sleep at all. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Josephine rose before dawn and made her way to Tempest's paddock. She did not try to approach him, did not demand anything. She simply sat on the fence and read aloud, sometimes poetry, sometimes passages from the small Bible her mother had given her before she died. The horse circled and snorted, and gradually, so gradually, she almost missed it, began to come closer. Silas watched from the barn door. He thought he was being subtle, but Josephine noticed everything. She noticed the way he worked himself twice as hard as any man should, pushing until his hands bled and his muscles screamed. She noticed the way he sat alone on the porch at night, staring at stars he seemed to hate for their beauty. She noticed the way he flinched whenever she got too close, as though kindness were a blade that might wound him. From Margaret she pieced together the story she already knew, but pretended to learn. Silas had been engaged once to a woman named Eleanor from a wealthy family in Denver. He had loved her desperately, had planned to build a life with her on this land that meant everything to him. But when his father fell ill and the ranch began to struggle, Eleanor had revealed her true nature. She had called him foolish for staying, had mocked his devotion to a dying man and a failing legacy. She had left him for a banker in St. Louis, taking his trust and his capacity for vulnerability with her. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Silas had buried himself in work and solitude, convinced that the only thing he could count on was the land beneath his feet. Josephine understood that kind of pain. She carried her own. Her mother had died when she was 17, worn down by grief and poverty and the relentless hardship of frontier life. Josephine had blamed herself for years. If she had worked harder, earned more money, been somehow better, she could have saved her. It had taken time to realize that some wounds were not anyone's fault. Some losses simply existed as part of the terrible beauty of living. On the 10th day, everything changed. A stranger rode into the ranch just after noon. He came in a black carriage pulled by matched grays, his suit immaculate despite the dust of the road. He introduced himself as Cyrus Thorne, representative of the Northern Railroad Company. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who knew the value of words and used them like weapons. Josephine was working with Tempest when the carriage arrived. She saw Silas emerge from the barn, saw him go rigid as stone when the stranger stepped down. Something about the set of his shoulders made her chest tighten with dread. She could not hear what they said, but she saw Silas's face go pale beneath his tan, saw him take the papers Cyrus Thorne offered, saw him read them with shaking hands. When the stranger left an hour later, Silas stood alone in the yard holding those papers like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Josephine wanted to go to him, wanted to ask what was wrong, but the look on his face kept her frozen in place. That evening, Margaret told her what had happened. "It's the debt," the older woman said quietly, kneading bread dough with the fierce energy of suppressed anger. "Jonathan Blackstone mortgaged the ranch 3 years ago, used the money to invest in a cattle venture with William Hartley." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, which had been drying dishes, went still. "How much?" $15,000. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Josephine had known her father had taken money from the Blackstones, but she had not known how much, had not understood the full scope of his betrayal. "The railroad is calling in the loan. They gave Silas 6 months to pay it in full or they'll take the ranch." Margaret's voice was flat, empty of hope. She had seen this before, seen good men destroyed by debts they could not pay, seen families torn apart, seen land that had been loved and tended for generations sold to strangers who cared nothing for what it meant. 6 months, Josephine whispered. 6 months. That night, Josephine sat alone in her small room and stared at the leather satchel she had brought with her. Inside was everything she owned: 3 dresses, a change of underclothes, the book of poetry, and a letter. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. She had read it so many times, she had memorized every word, but still she unfolded it carefully, as if it were something fragile that might crumble to dust at any moment. The handwriting was her father's, William Hartley's hand, precise and careful. My dearest Josephine, if you are reading this, I am gone. I pray that means I have found some peace, though I doubt peace is waiting for a man who has done what I have done. I have made terrible choices in my life. I have hurt people who trusted me. I have betrayed friendships for profit and convinced myself it was necessary. It was not. The Blackstones were good people. Jonathan treated me like a brother, and I destroyed him. I took his money knowing the venture would fail. I took it because Eleanor Morrison promised me a share of the profits from the railroad development if I could push the Blackstones into debt. She needed their land for the new route west. I was weak. I was greedy. I told myself I was securing your future, but all I did was secure my damnation. I cannot undo what I have done, but perhaps you can. The land I bought with my blood money I leave to you. Sell it. Use the money to repay the Blackstones. It will not be enough to cover everything, but it is a start. Please, Josephine, find a way to make this right. It is the only inheritance I can give you. The chance to redeem our name. Your loving father, William Hartley. Josephine read the words again and felt something crack open in her chest. Her father had been dead for 2 years. In that time she had sold the land he left her, had used the money to pay off his other debts, had kept barely enough to survive. But it had not been enough to cover what he owed the Blackstones, not even close. So she had come here, to this ranch, to this wounded man, hoping to find some way to make amends for sins she had not committed but felt responsible for all the same. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes against tears that would not come. She had cried herself empty over her father's betrayal. Now there was only this hollow ache, this desperate need to fix what he had broken, even if it cost her everything. The confrontation came on the morning of her 14th day at Blackstone Ranch. Josephine was in the paddock with Tempest. After 2 weeks of patient waiting, the horse had finally allowed her to approach. She stood beside him now, her hand resting on his warm neck, feeling the rapid thunder of his heart beneath her palm. It was a moment of such profound trust that she felt tears prick her eyes. How did you do that? Silas's voice behind her held something she had not heard before. Wonder, genuine, unguarded wonder. She turned to face him slowly, not wanting to spook the horse. Silas stood at the fence, his hands gripping the top rail so hard his knuckles had gone white. He looked at her the way a man might look at something impossible, something that defied the laws of his carefully ordered world. I showed him I had no intention of hurting him. I proved that my presence meant safety, not pain. Just like that. Nothing about this was just like that, Mr. Blackstone. It took time, patience, the willingness to be present without demanding anything in return. He climbed into the paddock, then moving slowly, carefully. Tempest shifted but did not bolt. Silas stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving between Josephine and the horse, as if trying to understand the alchemy that had transformed fear into trust. Why did you really come here, Josephine Hartley? The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. Her breath caught, her hand stilled on Tempest's neck. I told you I needed work. You're lying. He said it calmly without anger, a simple statement of fact. I've known who you were since before you arrived. William Hartley's daughter, the child of the man who destroyed my father. The world tilted. Josephine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He had known. All this time he had known. Your father's signature is on half the documents that ruined my family. Silas took a step closer. His voice remained steady, but she could see the storm building behind his eyes. Did he send you to finish the job, or are you here to ease your conscience? The accusation hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain, but the words tangled in her throat, coming out as barely a whisper. He's dead. I know. He left me nothing but guilt. I came to pay a debt I didn't create. Something flickered across Silas's face. Not quite sympathy, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. A debt. He laughed, then bitter and broken. Your father took $15,000 from mine. Took it knowing the investment would fail, knowing it would destroy us. What did you think you could do to repay that work a few months and call it even?" Josephine felt tears blur her vision, but she refused to let them fall. "I sold everything he left me. It wasn't enough. So I came here because I didn't know what else to do." She turned away from him, pressing her forehead against Tempest's warm neck. The horse stood steady beneath her touch, offering the kind of uncomplicated comfort that humans seemed incapable of giving. "I came because he asked me to in his last letter, because making this right is the only way I can live with his name." Silence stretched between them, broken only by Tempest's quiet breathing and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. When Silas finally spoke, his voice had changed, become harder, more controlled. "Then you'll work here. Every dollar you earn goes toward the debt. Every drop of sweat pays for his sins." Josephine turned to look at him. His face was set in lines of granite, but his eyes held something else. Something that looked almost like hope fighting desperately not to exist. "You want redemption? Earn it." She met his gaze without flinching, though her heart felt like it might shatter. "How long?" "As long as it takes." "And if it takes forever." For the first time since she had arrived, Silas smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of pain and dark promise. "Then I guess you'll be here forever." The first snow came early that year, dusting the Wyoming hills with white that melted by mid-morning, but left the air sharp and clean. Josephine woke before dawn on her 15th day at Blackstone Ranch and dressed in the darkness of her small room. Her hands were already calloused from 2 weeks of labor, but they would grow harder still. She had made a bargain with a man who had every reason to hate her, and she would keep it no matter the cost. Silas was waiting for her in the barn when she arrived. He stood in the doorway holding a list written in precise handwriting on a scrap of brown paper. He did not look at her when he handed it over, did not meet her eyes, just turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The list was long, impossibly long. Muck out all 12 stalls. Repair the fence on the eastern pasture. Reorganize the tack room. Exercise Tempest and the 3 other horses currently in training. Help Margaret with the midday meal. Inventory the grain stores. The tasks went on and on, each one more labor-intensive than the last. Josephine read the list twice and felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was not work. This was punishment. This was Silas making her pay for sins that were not hers in the currency of sweat and exhaustion. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. Then she picked up a pitchfork and got to work. By noon, her back screamed with every movement. Her shoulders burned. Her hands, despite the calluses, had opened new blisters that wept clear fluid. She worked through the pain with the grim determination of someone who had survived worse. When Margaret called her in for the midday meal, she ate standing up because sitting down meant she might not have the strength to rise again. Margaret watched her with eyes that missed nothing. "He's working you like a mule." Josephine took another bite of bread, chewing slowly. Her jaw ached. Everything ached. "I agreed to work. This isn't work. This is cruelty. Maybe I deserve it." Margaret set down her wooden spoon with enough force to make the pot ring. "You're not your father, child." The words hung in the kitchen air, warm with the smell of stew and baking bread. Josephine felt something crack in her chest, but refused to let it show. "Aren't I? I carry his name. I benefit from what he stole. How am I any different? Because you came back." Margaret's voice softened, losing its edge of anger. "William Hartley ran. You came here to face what he did. That's the difference between guilt and responsibility." Josephine had no answer for that. She finished her meal in silence and went back to work. What she did not see was Silas watching from the window of his study. He stood in the shadows where she could not spot him and tracked her progress across the ranch with eyes that held more conflict than he cared to admit. She moved with economy born of long practice, wasting no motion, pushing through exhaustion with a stubbornness that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. When she stumbled and caught herself on the fence rail, he found his hand pressed against the window glass as if he might reach through it to steady her. When she sat down heavily on a hay bale and put her head in her hands for just a moment before forcing herself back to her feet, He felt something twist in his gut that might have been shame. He told himself she deserved this, told himself that making her work until she broke was justice for what her father had done. But the lie tasted bitter even in the privacy of his own thoughts. Days became weeks in an endless cycle of exhaustion and endurance. Josephine rose in the dark and worked until she could barely see straight. She mucked stalls and mended fences and carried water and did 100 other tasks that left her so tired she sometimes fell asleep with her boots still on. But she never complained, never asked for mercy, never gave Silas the satisfaction of seeing her break. And slowly something began to shift. It started small. A week after their confrontation in the paddock, Josephine found her morning list had changed. The impossible number of tasks had been reduced to merely difficult. 2 weeks later, she discovered a jar of salve on her windowsill, unlabeled, unacknowledged. But when she rubbed it into her blistered hands that night, it smelled of arnica and calendula and something else she could not name, something that eased the pain and helped the wounds heal faster than they should. She never mentioned the salve. Silas never admitted to leaving it, but it appeared again when the jar ran empty, and then again after that. A silent conversation conducted in gestures neither of them would speak aloud. Tempest continued to transform. The wild fear that had defined him began to fade, replaced by a cautious trust that grew stronger with each passing day. Josephine worked with him in the early mornings and late evenings, the quiet hours when the ranch settled into itself, and the only sounds were the wind and the horses and the beating of her own heart. The weeks blurred together into a rhythm of labor and silence. By the time autumn's chill began to creep into the morning air, nearly 6 weeks after her arrival, Josephine had transformed from an outsider into something that felt almost like belonging. One morning, she arrived at the paddock to find Silas already there. He sat on the fence where she usually sat watching Tempest graze in the pale light of dawn. He did not turn when she approached, but his shoulders tensed in a way that told her he knew she was there. "I used to come out here every morning," he said quietly, "when my father was alive. We'd check the horses together before breakfast, plan the day's work." Josephine climbed onto the fence beside him, careful to leave space between them. Tempest raised his head at her arrival, but did not spook, just watched them with dark eyes that had learned to see humans as something other than threats. "He bought Tempest 3 months before he died," Silas continued. His voice had gone distant, lost in memory. "Paid top dollar for a horse that was supposed to have championship bloodlines. The papers looked legitimate. The seller seemed honest." He paused, and Josephine felt her stomach drop even before he spoke again. The seller was William Hartley. Of course it was. Of course her father's betrayal extended even here, even to this beautiful creature who had suffered for human greed. "The horse was sick," Silas said flatly. "Some kind of respiratory infection that should have killed him. My father spent everything he had left trying to save Tempest's life. The vet bills alone nearly bankrupted us." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes held a pain so raw it made her chest ache. "But the horse lived. Against all odds, he survived. My father died 2 weeks later, and I swore I'd never let anyone touch Tempest again. He was all I had left of my father's faith. His belief that some things were worth saving even when everyone said they were lost causes." Josephine understood then why Silas had been so angry when she approached the horse, why he had watched her work with Tempest with that mixture of hope and horror. She was healing the last living connection to his father. She was touching something sacred with hands that carried the taint of the man who had destroyed everything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry. Just don't stop." He climbed down from the fence and walked away before she could respond. But when she went to the barn later that morning, she found her task list had changed again. Half the jobs had been crossed out. In the margin in Silas's precise handwriting were 3 words: "Focus on Tempest." It was the closest thing to kindness he had shown her. She pressed the paper to her chest and felt something warm bloom beneath her ribs, something dangerous, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. That afternoon, everything changed. Josephine was in the tack room organizing bridles when she heard the sound of hooves and wheels in the yard. She looked out the window and felt her blood turn to ice. A carriage had pulled up to the house. Not the plain black vehicle Cyrus Thorne had arrived in, but something finer. Something that spoke of money and status and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about either. The door opened and a woman stepped down, and even from a distance, Josephine could see she was beautiful. Eleanor Morrison moved like someone accustomed to being watched. Her dress was the color of cream, expertly tailored to show her figure without being improper. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. Everything about her screamed wealth and refinement, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from knowing the world would bend to accommodate her wishes. Josephine watched Silas emerge from the barn, watched him go absolutely still when he saw who had arrived. Even from here she could see the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Eleanor smiled. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. Josephine could not hear what they said, but she saw Eleanor reach out and touch Silas's arm, saw him jerk away as if burned, saw Eleanor's smile falter for just a moment before hardening into something more determined. Then Eleanor turned and looked directly at the window where Josephine stood. Their eyes met across the distance, and Josephine felt the impact like a physical blow. Eleanor's gaze swept over her, dismissive and assessing all at once. Then she turned back to Silas and said something that made his face go pale. The door to the tack room opened behind Josephine. She spun to find Margaret standing there, her face grim. "You'd better come inside. There's trouble." The kitchen had never felt so small. Josephine stood by the stove while Margaret bustled around with the restless energy of suppressed anxiety. Through the window she could see Silas and Eleanor still talking in the yard. A third figure had joined them. Cyrus Thorne stepping down from the carriage with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly how much power he wielded. "That woman is poison," Margaret said quietly. "She destroyed Silas once. Now she's come back to finish the job." "What does she want?" Margaret's hands stilled in the dishwater. "The ranch. She's always wanted the ranch, or rather she's wanted what the ranch could give her." Before Josephine could ask what that meant, the kitchen door opened. Silas stood in the doorway, his face carved from stone. Behind him, Eleanor swept in like she owned the place, her skirts rustling expensively. She looked around the kitchen with an expression of faint distaste, as if the homey warmth of the room offended her sensibilities. "So this is where you've been hiding," Eleanor said, her eyes landing on Josephine. "How quaint." Josephine said nothing, just met Eleanor's gaze steadily, and waited. "Eleanor, this is Josephine Hartley. She works here." Silas's voice was carefully neutral, but Josephine could hear the tension thrumming beneath. "Hartley?" Eleanor's smile sharpened. "That name sounds familiar. Should I know it?" "Her father was William Hartley," Silas said flatly. Eleanor's eyebrows rose in what looked like genuine surprise. "Oh my, another charity case. Silas, you really do have a weakness for broken things, don't you?" The condescension in her voice made Josephine's hands curl into fists, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm not here for charity." "No?" Eleanor circled her slowly, like a cat examining a mouse. "Then why love perhaps don't make me laugh. Silas will never love again. I made sure of that." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Josephine like a slap, but it was the flicker of pain in Silas's eyes that made her anger flare hot and bright. "If you're quite finished being unpleasant," Margaret said sharply, "perhaps you could state your business and leave." Eleanor turned her smile on the older woman. "My business is with Silas. And Mr. Thorne, of course." Cyrus had followed them inside his tall frame filling the doorway. He nodded to Josephine with a politeness that felt rehearsed. "We've come with a proposition," Eleanor continued, turning back to Silas. "A way to solve all your financial troubles in one fell swoop." "I'm not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." "I don't need to. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Eleanor's smile never wavered. "The Northern Railroad Company is prepared to purchase Blackstone Ranch. The full 15,000 acres, including mineral rights and water access. They're offering enough to not only pay off your debt, but to leave you with a substantial profit." Silence fell like a hammer. Josephine felt her heart stutter in her chest. This was it. This was the real reason Cyrus Thorne had come with that debt notice. not to collect what was owed, but to force Silas into a corner where selling was the only option. "The ranch isn't for sale," Silas said quietly. "Be reasonable," Cyrus interjected, his voice smooth as oil. "You have 6 months to pay a debt you can't possibly cover. The railroad is offering you a way out, a generous way out." I said no. "Silas," Eleanor's voice shifted, becoming softer, almost pleading. "Don't be a fool. This land has brought you nothing but pain. Your father died trying to hold on to it. It's killing you the same way. Take the money, start somewhere new, be free of this burden." "My father didn't die trying to hold on to the land," Silas said, and his voice had gone cold as winter stone. "He died because someone betrayed him, someone he trusted." His eyes moved to Josephine for just a moment, and she felt the accusation like a knife between her ribs. But there was something else there, too, something that looked almost like regret. Eleanor followed his gaze, and her smile returned sharp and knowing. "Ah, yes, the sins of the father. How biblical. Tell me, Miss Hartley, does it bother you, working here to pay off your father's debts like some kind of indentured servant?" "That's enough," Silas snapped. "Is it, or are we just getting started?" Eleanor turned back to him, and for the first time Josephine saw something genuine flicker behind her polished facade. Desperation. This sale mattered to her for reasons that went beyond simple business. "I'm trying to help you," Eleanor said. "We could have had a life together, Silas. We could have been happy, but you chose this dying ranch over me, over us. Now I'm giving you a chance to be free of it, to move on." "You left me," Silas said quietly. "You walked away when things got hard because you never loved me. You loved what you thought I could give you. And when that disappeared, so did you. That's not fair." "Fair?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "You want to talk about fair? Get out, both of you. This ranch isn't for sale. Not to the railroad, not to anyone." Cyrus straightened, his expression hardening. "You have 6 months, Mr. Blackstone. If you can't pay the debt by then, we'll take the ranch anyway. This offer is your only chance to walk away with something. Then I guess I'll spend the next 6 months figuring out how to pay what I owe." Eleanor's mask finally cracked. For just a moment, Josephine saw raw fury flash across her beautiful face. "You're making a mistake. Probably, but it's my mistake to make." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then Eleanor gathered her skirts and swept toward the door. She paused beside Josephine, leaning in close enough that only she could hear the whispered words. "He'll lose everything. And when he does, it will be your father's fault. Again. Can you live with that?" Then she was gone, Cyrus following in her wake. The carriage pulled away in a cloud of dust, and Josephine stood frozen in the kitchen. Eleanor's question burning in her mind like acid. That night, Josephine could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the moonlight that crept through her window. Eleanor's words echoed endlessly. "He'll lose everything. And when he does, it will be your father's fault. Again." She knew what she needed to do, had known from the moment Eleanor made that offer. But knowing and accepting were two different things. At midnight she rose and lit her lamp. Then she pulled out the worn leather satchel that held everything she owned. Her fingers found the hidden pocket in the lining, the one she had sewn shut 2 years ago and sworn never to open. She picked at the stitches with shaking hands until the thread gave way. Inside was a small book bound in cracked leather, her father's ledger, the record he had kept of every transaction, every deal, every choice that had led him down the path of betrayal. Josephine had found it among his things after he died and had been unable to destroy it. Some part of her needed to understand what he had done, needed to see the progression from honest man to thief written out in his own careful handwriting. She opened it now with hands that trembled in the lamplight. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the writing was still legible. She had read it all before, had memorized the dates and amounts and the names of people her father had wronged. But tonight she read with new eyes, looking for something, anything, some detail she might have missed. She found it on page 47. The entry was dated 3 years and 2 months ago. A meeting with Jonathan Blackstone to discuss the cattle venture, terms agreed upon, investment secured. And then 2 lines down another note. E.M. approached me after the meeting. Offered additional compensation if venture fails. Railroad expansion requires Blackstone land. J.B. must be forced to sell. Promised 20% of development profits. E.M. Eleanor Morrison. Josephine read the entry 3 times, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Her father had not acted alone. Eleanor had orchestrated the entire thing, had approached William Hartley and dangled money in front of a man already struggling to provide for his family, had planted the seeds of betrayal and watched them grow. She turned the page, found more entries, more meetings, more money changing hands. Her father's handwriting grew shakier as the dates progressed, as if his hand trembled with guilt, even as he accepted Eleanor's bribes. In the final entry written just weeks before he disappeared, the words were barely legible. "I am damned. God forgive me. I have destroyed a good man for silver. The Blackstones will lose everything, their land, their future, and I am the instrument of their ruin. E.M. promises the railroad will purchase the property once J.B. defaults on his loans. My share will be enough to secure Jay's future. But what future can be built on such foundations? What kind of father teaches his daughter that survival requires the destruction of innocence?" The page was stained. Watermarks that might have been tears blurred the ink in places. Josephine touched them with her fingertips and felt a grief so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Her father had known what he was doing, had hated himself for it, had done it anyway because he thought he was protecting her. And Eleanor had used that love, had weaponized a father's devotion to his daughter and turned it into a tool for her own enrichment. Josephine closed the ledger carefully. Her hands no longer shook. The initial shock had given way to something colder, something that felt like clarity. She knew what she had to do now. The next morning, she waited until Silas left for the far pasture to check the cattle. Then she saddled her mare and rode into town. The journey took 2 hours, and with every mile she felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. Cheyenne was bustling with midday activity when she arrived. She tied her horse outside the Grand Hotel where Cyrus Thorne had told Silas he was staying. The desk clerk gave her a suspicious look when she asked for his room number, but she stared him down with eyes that had learned how to demand respect in a world that rarely gave it freely. Cyrus opened his door on the 3rd knock. His eyebrows rose when he saw her. "Miss Hartley, this is unexpected." "I have information," she said without preamble. "Information that could help your railroad project." His expression shifted, becoming more alert, more interested. "What kind of information?" "The kind that doesn't get discussed in hotel hallways." He stepped aside and gestured her in. The room was well-appointed, expensive in the way that railroad money could afford. Josephine remained standing near the door, keeping her exit clear. "I have geological survey maps," she said, "of Blackstone Ranch and the surrounding territory. My father conducted them years ago. They show mineral deposits, small veins of gold and silver, not enough for major mining operations, but enough to make the land significantly more valuable than Mr. Blackstone realizes." Cyrus's eyes gleamed with the particular greed of men who traded in property and profit. "How much more valuable? Enough that your railroad company would want to secure it quickly before word gets out. And you're willing to provide these maps in exchange for forgiveness of the Blackstone debt, $15,000, erased completely." Cyrus studied her for a long moment. She could see him calculating, weighing the value of information against the cost of debt forgiveness. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I would need to see the maps first, verify their authenticity." "Of course. I'll bring them to you tomorrow." "Why are you doing this?" The question caught her off guard. She met his gaze steadily. "Because some debts can't be paid with money, only with action." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Morrison will want to be involved in this negotiation." Josephine's hand tightened on the doorknob. "Then arrange a meeting for tomorrow afternoon, the 3 of us. No one else." She left before he could respond, rode back to the ranch with her heart beating a rhythm that sounded like both victory and defeat. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Josephine sat on the porch steps and watched Silas work in the corral. He was training a young gelding, his movements patient and sure. There was a grace to the way he worked with horses that she found herself admiring more than she should, a gentleness that seemed at odds with the hard exterior he showed the rest of the world. Margaret came out and sat beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're leaving, aren't you?" It was not a question. Josephine did not pretend to be surprised that Margaret had guessed. "How did you know?" "I've been watching people make hard choices for 50 years, child. I know what it looks like when someone is saying goodbye." Josephine pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small. "I'm trying to fix what my father broke." "By breaking yourself, if necessary." Margaret sighed, a sound full of old sorrow and hard-won wisdom. "There's something you should know about Jonathan Blackstone, about what he knew before he died." She pulled a folded letter from her apron pocket. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind Jonathan would have used for important correspondence. Margaret held it for a moment as if weighing whether to hand it over. Then she placed it carefully in Josephine's hands. "He wrote this 2 days before he passed. Made me promise to give it to Silas when the time was right. But Silas was so destroyed by grief, so angry at the world, that he burned every document his father left behind, every letter, every piece of advice, every word of comfort. He couldn't bear to read them." Josephine unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the words of a dying man who knew his time was short. "My son, if you are reading this, I have left you. I pray you can forgive me for that, though I know the leaving itself is not what will require forgiveness. By now you will have discovered the full extent of William Hartley's betrayal. You will have learned that the man I trusted destroyed us with full knowledge of what he was doing. You will be angry. You will want revenge. But there is something else you must know. William Hartley was not the architect of our ruin. He was merely the instrument. The real snake in our garden was Eleanor Morrison. She approached him weeks before the cattle venture was proposed. She offered him money to sabotage the project, to ensure that I would default on my loans and be forced to sell the ranch. The railroad wants our land for their western expansion. Eleanor stands to profit handsomely if she can deliver it to them. Hartley was weak, yes. He was greedy, but he was also desperate. He had a daughter to provide for and debts of his own. Eleanor preyed on that desperation. She is the true villain of this story. I tell you this not to absolve Hartley of blame. He made his choices and must answer for them before God. But I tell you this so that you might direct your anger toward the one who truly deserves it, and so that you might find room in your heart to forgive a fool who was manipulated by someone far more cunning. Forgive the fool, Silas. Destroy the snake. And remember that the best revenge is not bitterness, but success. Hold on to this ranch. Make it thrive. Build a family here. Fill these empty rooms with love and laughter. That is how you defeat those who tried to destroy us, not with hate but with life. Your loving father, Jonathan Blackstone. Josephine read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Jonathan had known, had understood the full scope of Eleanor's manipulation, had tried to pass that knowledge to his son so Silas would not spend his life hating the wrong person. But Silas had never read these words, had never known that his father's final wish was for forgiveness. "Why are you showing this to me?" Josephine whispered. "Because you need to understand something," Margaret said gently. "This hatred Silas carries for your father, it's misdirected. Jonathan knew that. He wanted Silas to know it too. But sometimes grief makes us deaf to the truth. It doesn't change what my father did. No, but it changes what you owe. William Hartley's debt isn't to Silas, it's to his own conscience. And that debt died with him. You don't have to carry it for him." Josephine folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Margaret. "Keep it," the older woman said. "Give it to Silas when this is over. Let him read his father's words. Let him understand that forgiveness was always possible." That night, Josephine packed her few belongings into her worn satchel. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. But as she reached for her coat, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Margaret appeared in the doorway, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Food for the journey," she said quietly. "And this." She pressed something into Josephine's hand, a folded piece of paper. Josephine opened it to find a name and address written in Margaret's careful script. "My sister lives in Denver. If you need a place to stay, after this is done, if you need somewhere safe." Josephine's throat tightened with emotion she could not express. "Thank you." Margaret pulled her into a fierce hug, the kind that mothers give daughters when they know goodbye might be forever. "You're a good girl, Josephine Hartley. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then she was gone, leaving Josephine alone in the darkness with her choices and her grief. The meeting took place the next afternoon in a private dining room at the Grand Hotel. Eleanor arrived dressed in burgundy silk, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours. She looked at Josephine with barely concealed contempt, but there was something else in her eyes too, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of respect for someone willing to play the game. Cyrus sat at the head of the table, a stack of legal documents before him. Josephine took the chair across from Eleanor and laid her father's ledger on the table between them. "Before we discuss maps and mineral rights," she said quietly, "I think you should both know exactly what kind of arrangement you're entering into." She opened the ledger to the relevant pages and slid it across the table to Cyrus. Watched his expression change as he read, watched understanding dawn, and then harden into something that looked like anger. "This implicates Miss Morrison in fraud and conspiracy." Eleanor's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied powder. "That's a forgery. My lawyers will prove it." "Your lawyers can try," Josephine said calmly. "But I have other documents, letters in your handwriting, bank records showing payments made to William Hartley, enough evidence to ensure that the railroad company will want nothing to do with you once this becomes public." She turned to Cyrus. "Unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement, one that benefits everyone involved." The silence that followed was electric. Eleanor stared at her with something that might have been hatred or might have been grudging admiration. Cyrus looked between them like a man watching a chess game he had not realized he was playing. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, finally, her voice stripped of its usual sweetness. "Forgiveness of the Blackstone debt, complete and unconditional. No claims on the ranch, no future contact with Silas Blackstone. And in exchange, I give you the geological survey maps. I keep my father's ledger and all associated evidence locked away, and I disappear. Tonight. Forever." "You'd leave?" Cyrus asked, clearly surprised. "Some debts can only be paid with distance." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Then slowly a smile spread across her beautiful face. It was not a kind smile. "Very well. But I have one additional condition." "What?" "You leave tonight, this very night. And you never tell Silas Blackstone the truth about any of this. Not about my role in his father's death. Not about your sacrifice. He lives the rest of his life thinking William Hartley was the sole villain, and thinking you abandoned him just like everyone else." The cruelty of it took Josephine's breath away. Eleanor wanted Silas to suffer, wanted him to believe he had been betrayed again, wanted him to carry that pain for the rest of his life. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Because he chose that ranch over me. Because he wouldn't bend, wouldn't compromise. And if I can't have him, I want him to be alone, to know what it feels like to lose everything." Josephine looked at Eleanor Morrison and saw something so broken it made her own pain seem small by comparison. This woman had never loved Silas, had perhaps never loved anyone but herself. And in her twisted logic, his refusal to be destroyed by her was the ultimate insult. "Agree to my terms," Eleanor said softly, "and the debt disappears. Refuse, and I'll make sure that ranch is seized within the month. Your choice, Miss Hartley. Save the man you love or satisfy your need to be seen as noble." The man you love. The words hung in the air like an accusation, because it was true. Somewhere in the past month and a half, between the hard labor and the harder silences, between watching Silas' gentle tempest and feeling his eyes on her, when he thought she could not see, Josephine had fallen in love with a man who would never know it. She reached across the table and signed the documents Cyrus pushed toward her, watched him countersign, watched Eleanor's smile grow wider and more triumphant. "Pleasure doing business with you," Eleanor said. Josephine gathered the maps she had brought, handed them over, and left without another word. She walked out of the hotel and untied her mare and rode back to Blackstone Ranch for the last time. The sun was setting when she arrived. The ranch looked beautiful in the golden light, the land rolling away in gentle hills toward mountains that touched the sky. She wanted to memorize it, wanted to carry this image with her wherever she went next. She packed quickly, moving through her small room with the efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light. Everything she owned fit into one satchel and a small trunk. The book of poetry, her mother's Bible, the few dresses she had not worn through, and Jonathan Blackstone's letter to his son, which she slipped into an envelope and addressed in careful script. She left it on Silas's desk in the study, propped against the lamp where he could not miss it. Then she walked out to the paddock one last time. Tempest came to her immediately, nuzzling her hand with a gentleness that made her chest ache. She pressed her forehead against his warm neck and let herself cry for everything she was losing, for the man she loved who would hate her, for the life she might have built here if the world were different, for her father's sins and her own choices and the terrible price of redemption. "Be good to him," she whispered to the horse. "He needs you. He needs to remember that trust is possible." Then she walked away before her courage could fail. She did not see Silas standing in the barn doorway, did not see the way his hand reached toward her as if to call her back, did not see him find the letter on his desk an hour later, his hands shaking as he read his father's final words. By the time he finished reading, by the time he understood what his father had tried to tell him about Eleanor, and forgiveness, and misdirected hate, Josephine was already miles away. Her horse's hooves carried her down the road toward Cheyenne in the darkness, and in her pocket was a scrap of paper with Margaret's sister's address and the ruins of a future that would never be. Behind her, Tempest stood at the paddock fence and screamed into the night. A sound of loss that echoed across the hills like grief made audible. And in his study, Silas Blackstone sat alone in the darkness and finally let himself cry. The train to Denver left at dawn, but Silas Blackstone did not wait for dawn. He rode through the darkness like a man possessed, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. The letter from his father was folded in his breast pocket, pressed against his heart like a talisman or a curse. He had read it 3 times by lamplight, each reading stripping away another layer of the armor he had worn for 3 years. His father had known, had understood the true architect of their destruction, had tried to pass that knowledge to his son with his dying breath. And Silas had been too consumed by grief and rage to listen, had burned every other letter, every piece of advice, every word of comfort his father had left behind, had chosen bitterness over truth. The revelation had shattered something fundamental in him. All this time he had blamed William Hartley, had transferred that blame to Josephine like original sin passed from father to daughter, had punished her for crimes she did not commit, making her pay for betrayals that were not hers to answer for. And she had let him, had accepted his cruelty without complaint, had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to redeem a debt that was never truly hers. The sky was just beginning to lighten when he reached the outskirts of Cheyenne. The town was still sleeping, windows, dark streets empty, except for a few early risers heading to work. Silas rode straight to the train station, his heart hammering against his ribs with something that felt like fear. The platform was nearly deserted. A conductor checked his pocket watch. 2 travelers sat on benches with their luggage piled beside them, and there at the far end of the platform stood Josephine. She wore her traveling dress, the dark blue one she had been wearing the day she arrived. Her worn satchel sat at her feet, and she held herself with the rigid posture of someone fighting not to break. Even from a distance, Silas could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, the defeat in the way she stared at the tracks as if willing the train to arrive faster. He dismounted and walked toward her, his boots loud on the wooden platform. She heard him coming. He saw her spine stiffen, saw her hands clench into fists at her sides, but she did not turn around. "Josephine." His voice came out rougher than he intended, raw from the hours of riding and the tears he had finally allowed himself to shed. She turned slowly, and the look on her face nearly broke him. She had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks still damp. But what destroyed him was the resignation in her expression, the look of someone who had already said goodbye and did not have the strength to do it again. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Neither should you. The train leaves in 20 minutes. Then we have 20 minutes. He took a step closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat, the way her breath came shallow and quick. I read my father's letter. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, and beneath it a flash of pain so acute it made him flinch. Then you know, she whispered. I know Eleanor orchestrated everything. I know your father was her instrument, not her partner. I know I've been blaming the wrong person for 3 years. It doesn't change what he did, no, but it changes what you owe. It changes everything. The train whistle sounded in the distance, a mournful cry that echoed across the empty plains. Josephine turned toward the sound, and Silas saw her jaw tighten with determination. I have to go. Why? Because I made a deal. Because it was the only way to save the ranch. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. The maps. The mineral surveys. The sudden appearance of Eleanor and Cyrus at the ranch. Josephine's midnight ride to town. It all clicked into place with horrible clarity. What did you give them? Information they wanted, in exchange for forgiveness of the debt. And what did they want in return? She finally met his eyes, and he saw the truth there before she spoke it. They wanted me to leave, tonight, and never tell you what Eleanor did. The cruelty of it stole his breath. Eleanor had not just wanted to destroy him financially, she had wanted to destroy him emotionally, to make him believe he had been abandoned again, to ensure he spent the rest of his life thinking Josephine had been just another person who left when things got hard. You were going to let me think that, he said, and his voice shook with something that might have been fury or heartbreak or both. You were going to disappear and let me believe you were just like her? It was part of the deal. Damn the deal. He grabbed her shoulders, not roughly, but firmly enough to make her look at him, to make her see the desperation in his face. You think leaving will fix anything? You think giving me freedom from debt while taking away the one person who actually stayed is some kind of gift? I'm giving you your ranch back, your future, everything my father stole. I don't want it, not like this, not at the cost of losing you. Silas, let me finish. He took a deep breath, trying to find words for things he had never learned how to say. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that I don't need anyone, that solitude is safety, that if I never let anyone close again, I can never be hurt. But watching you work with Tempest, watching you give patience and kindness so freely, watching you refuse to give up on something everyone else had abandoned, it made me realize something. What? Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile as spun glass. I don't want safety. I want to live. I want to feel. I want you. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair and the warmth of her skin. Even if it terrifies me, even if it means risking everything, because a life without risk is not really living at all. For a moment she melted into him. Her hands came up to clutch his shirt, and he felt her body shake with silent sobs. Then she pushed him away, gently but firmly. It's too late. I already made the deal. If I don't leave, Eleanor will destroy everything anyway. Then let her try. You don't understand. She has lawyers, resources. The railroad company behind her. She'll bury you in legal fees even if you win. I don't care. I care. Her voice broke on the words, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I watched my father's choices destroy your family once. I won't let my choices do it again, even if it means losing you. The train appeared on the horizon, a dark shape against the lightening sky. Smoke billowed from its stack, and the sound of its approach grew steadily louder. Josephine bent to pick up her satchel, but Silas caught her wrist. Don't go, please. We'll find another way. There is no other way. Then we'll make one. But before he could say more, before he could find the words that might change her mind, a new voice cut through the morning air. Mr. Blackstone, Miss Hartley, how fortunate to find you both here. They turned to find Cyrus Thorne standing at the edge of the platform, flanked by 2 men in suits who had the look of lawyers or hired muscle. Eleanor stood beside him, wrapped in a fur coat, despite the mild morning, her expression triumphant. The train won't be necessary after all, Eleanor said, her voice dripping false sweetness. It seems Miss Hartley has violated the terms of our agreement. What are you talking about? Josephine asked, her face pale. Cyrus held up a document, his expression grave. Our agreement stipulated that you would leave immediately and make no contact with Mr. Blackstone. Yet here you are still in Cheyenne, engaged in what appears to be a rather intimate conversation. I am leaving. The train is right there. But you told him about our arrangement. I can see it in his face. You broke our contract, Miss Hartley. Which means the debt forgiveness is void. Eleanor's smile was pure venom. The ranch will be seized within the week. Thank you for the geological surveys, though. They'll make the property even more valuable once we acquire it. Silas felt rage surge through him, hot and blinding. He took a step toward Eleanor, and one of the suited men moved to intercept him. But before anyone could act, another voice rang out across the platform. I wouldn't be so sure about that. Margaret Thorne emerged from the station house, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and her expression held the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from holding all the cards in a high-stakes game. Mrs. Thorne, Cyrus said, clearly surprised, what are you doing here? Delivering justice, something that's been a long time coming. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a sheaf of documents. When she spoke, her voice carried across the platform with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime observing and remembering. I have here a complete accounting of every transaction between Eleanor Morrison and William Hartley. Letters in Miss Morrison's handwriting detailing her scheme to defraud Jonathan Blackstone. Bank records showing payments made to Hartley in exchange for sabotaging the cattle venture. And testimony from 3 witnesses who heard Miss Morrison discussing her plans to acquire Blackstone Ranch through illegal means. Eleanor's face had gone from triumphant to ashen in the space of a heartbeat. Those are forgeries. My lawyers will prove it. Your lawyers can try, Margaret said calmly, but I also have this. She pulled out another document, this one older and more official-looking. A birth certificate yellowed with age but clearly legible. Josephine Marie Hartley. Born April 15, 1862 in Denver, Colorado. Mother Catherine Ann Sullivan. Father Thomas Michael Sullivan. Josephine made a small sound of confusion. Margaret turned to her, and for the first time her stern expression softened into something that looked almost like tenderness. William Hartley was not your biological father-child. Thomas Sullivan was. He died when you were 4 years old, leaving your mother destitute. William married her a year later and adopted you legally. He gave you his name, raised you as his own, but you do not carry his blood. The world seemed to tilt beneath Josephine's feet. Silas caught her elbow to steady her, felt her trembling like a leaf in a high wind. How do you know this? She whispered. Because I knew your mother, knew her well. We were friends once, long ago. Margaret's voice had gone soft, remembering. Catherine was a good woman. She loved Thomas desperately. When he died, it broke something in her. William was kind to take her in, to give you both a home. But he was a weak man, susceptible to temptation. When Eleanor came calling with her schemes and her promises of wealth, he could not resist. She turned back to Eleanor and Cyrus, her expression hardening once more. Which means Josephine Hartley owes nothing for William's crimes. She is not his daughter by blood. She has no legal or moral obligation to repay debts he incurred through fraud and conspiracy. Cyrus was staring at the documents in Margaret's hands with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed plans crumble to dust. Even if what you say is true, it doesn't change the fact that Jonathan Blackstone defaulted on his loans. Loans obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, Margaret countered. Eleanor Morrison induced William Hartley to sabotage a legitimate business venture for her personal gain. That constitutes fraud under territorial law. Any debts resulting from that fraud are invalid. She pulled out yet another document. I took the liberty of consulting with a lawyer in Cheyenne last night, a very good lawyer who specializes in property law and financial fraud. He's prepared to file suit against both Eleanor Morrison and the Northern Railroad Company on behalf of the Blackstone estate. The suit will seek not only dismissal of the debt, but also substantial damages for the suffering caused by Miss Morrison's illegal actions. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. Color flooded back into her face, but now it was the red of fury barely controlled. You're bluffing. You don't have the money for a lawyer. I have enough, Margaret said quietly. I've been saving my wages for 25 years. Every penny I earned working for the Blackstone family. I was going to use it to buy a small house in town when I got too old to work, but this seems like a better investment." Silas stared at her, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was offering. Margaret had devoted her life to his family, had stayed when others left, had worked for wages that were barely enough to live on because she loved them, and now she was willing to sacrifice her entire future to save his. "Margaret, I can't let you do this." "You can't stop me. The papers are already filed." Eleanor turned to Cyrus, her voice sharp with desperation. "Do something! You're the railroad's representative. You have resources." But Cyrus was already backing away, his expression calculating. "I represent the Northern Railroad Company's interests, Miss Morrison, not yours personally. If these allegations of fraud are true, the company will not want to be associated with such activities. We have a reputation to maintain." "You coward," Eleanor spat. "This was your plan too. You were going to profit just as much as I was." "I have no idea what you're talking about." Cyrus's voice was smooth as oil, all previous camaraderie gone. "I came here as a representative of the company to collect a legitimate debt. If that debt was obtained through fraudulent means, then the company will, of course, withdraw its claim and cooperate fully with any investigation." He tipped his hat to Margaret, studiously avoiding Eleanor's furious gaze. "Good day, Mrs. Thorne, Mr. Blackstone, Miss Hartley." Then he was gone, his lawyers following like shadows, leaving Eleanor alone on the platform with her plans in ruins around her. She looked at Silas with an expression of such pure hatred it was almost impressive in its intensity. "You did this. You turned everyone against me." "I did nothing," Silas said quietly. "You destroyed yourself." "I loved you." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Silas shook his head slowly. "No, you didn't. You loved what you thought I could give you. And when that disappeared, so did any pretense of affection. Real love doesn't abandon people when times get hard. It doesn't manipulate and scheme and destroy. What you felt for me was possession, not love." Eleanor's face twisted with emotion too complex to name. For just a moment, Josephine almost felt sorry for her, almost saw the broken, desperate thing beneath the beautiful facade. A woman so convinced that worth came from wealth and status that she had lost the ability to value anything real. Then the moment passed. Eleanor gathered her fur coat around her shoulders and walked away without another word. Her heels clicked on the wooden platform, each step carrying her further from the life she had tried to steal. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam. Passengers began to board, moving around the small group still standing frozen on the platform. Josephine looked at the train, then at her satchel, then at Silas. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Any of this. William Hartley wasn't my father." "My mother never told me she was protecting you," Margaret said gently. "Catherine knew William's business dealings were questionable. She feared that if anything happened to him, if his crimes came to light, you would be tainted by association. So she kept the secret. Let you believe you were his blood so you would have a father's name and protection. But why didn't she tell me before she died? Because she loved you. And sometimes love means carrying burdens alone so others don't have to." Margaret reached out and touched Josephine's cheek with a tenderness that seemed at odds with her usually stern demeanor. "You are free, child, free of William Hartley's sins, free of debts you never owed, free to choose your own path without the weight of someone else's choices crushing you." Josephine felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different. Not tears of grief or loss, but of something that felt dangerously like relief. Like the lifting of a burden she had carried for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The train whistle blew, calling the last passengers aboard. The conductor stepped onto the platform and called out the departure. "Last call for Denver. All aboard." Josephine looked at the train, looked at Silas, and for the first time in months allowed herself to consider a future that did not involve running, did not involve sacrifice, did not involve paying endlessly for crimes committed by people who were already dead. "I don't have to go," she said, as if testing the words. "No," Silas agreed. "You don't. The deal with Eleanor is void, completely void, and the ranch will be fine. Thanks to Margaret." They both turned to look at the older woman who was watching them with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been something deeper. Something that looked almost like a secret finally told. "You sacrificed everything for us," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your savings, your future. Why?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words came slowly, as if she were picking her way carefully through a minefield of truth. "Because 25 years ago, a man named Jonathan Blackstone gave me a job when no one else would. I was alone, disgraced, pregnant with a child I could not keep. He asked no questions, made no judgments, just gave me work and a place to sleep and the dignity of earning my own way." She looked at Josephine, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I had a baby girl, April 15th, 1862. I was too young, too poor, too ashamed to raise her myself. So I gave her to a good woman named Catherine Sullivan, who had just lost her husband and was desperate for purpose. Catherine promised to love her, to raise her as her own, to give her the life I could not provide." The words hung in the air like snowflakes, delicate and impossible to catch. Josephine's breath stopped in her chest. The world narrowed to a single point of understanding so enormous it seemed to swallow everything else. "You," she whispered. "I am your mother," Margaret said, and her voice broke on the words. "Not Catherine. She was a wonderful mother to you. She loved you as fiercely as any woman could love a child. But I gave you life, and I have spent every day since watching you from a distance, loving you, protecting you when I could. You knew William Hartley wasn't my father because you knew who my father was, Thomas Sullivan. A good man, an honest man. He died never knowing you existed. I met him after I had already given you away. He married Catherine knowing she had a child. He loved you both with his whole heart." Margaret took a step closer, her hands trembling. "When Catherine wrote to me about William Hartley's betrayal, when she told me how it weighed on your conscience, I knew I had to do something. So I arranged for you to come here. I made sure Silas saw the posting I created. I knew if you met each other, if you understood each other's pain, something might grow between you that could heal you both." "You manipulated us," Silas said, but there was no anger in his voice, only wonder. "I gave you both a chance. What you did with it was your choice." She turned to Josephine. "Forgive me, child. I could not watch you destroy yourself trying to pay for sins that were never yours. I could not let you sacrifice your happiness for some twisted sense of inherited guilt. So I told myself I was doing it for Silas, for Jonathan's memory. But the truth is I did it for you, because a mother's love does not end just because she gives her child away." Josephine could not speak, could not breathe, could not process the enormity of what she had just learned. Her whole life had been built on foundations that turned out to be made of sand. William Hartley was not her father. Catherine Sullivan was not her mother. Margaret Thorne, the stern cook who had watched her with such careful attention, was the woman who had given her life. She should have been angry, should have felt betrayed, but all she felt was a strange, overwhelming sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was solving had suddenly clicked into place. "Say something," Margaret whispered. "Please." Josephine crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and threw her arms around the older woman. Margaret gasped in surprise, then wrapped her arms around Josephine and held on as if she might never let go. They stood there on the train platform while morning light spilled across the mountains and turned the world golden. 2 women who had found each other after a lifetime apart. "I forgive you," Josephine whispered against Margaret's shoulder, "for everything, for giving me away, for the secrets, for all of it. Thank you." Margaret's voice was muffled by tears and relief, and 3 decades of held breath finally released. "Thank you for coming back to me." Silas stood a few feet away, watching them with an expression of such profound tenderness it transformed his whole face. When Josephine finally pulled away from Margaret and turned to look at him, he was smiling, a real smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. "So," he said softly, "does this mean you're staying?" Josephine looked at the train now pulling away from the station in a cloud of steam and smoke, looked at Margaret, her mother who had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at happiness, looked at Silas, the man she loved with an intensity that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "I'm staying." "Good." He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was soft at first, questioning, as if he still could not quite believe she was real. Then it deepened into something that felt like promise and possession, and the kind of desperate relief that comes from finding something you thought was lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Josephine laughed. A real laugh, bright and free, and utterly without the weight of guilt that had pressed on her for so long. "What?" Silas asked, his forehead resting against hers. "I was just thinking about what I said that first day, about controlling the beast beneath." She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him close. "I was wrong. There is no beast, just a man with a tender heart who needed someone to see him clearly. And you see me, I see you." They kissed again, deeper this time, and Josephine felt herself falling, not into danger, not into pain, but into the kind of love she had stopped believing existed. 6 months later, winter had given way to spring, and Blackstone Ranch was transformed. The fences had been mended and reinforced. The barn wore a fresh coat of paint. The cattle in the distant fields had grown fat and healthy, and new calves gamboled in the sunshine. The ranch hands Silas had been forced to let go during the lean years had returned, drawn by wages he could finally afford to pay and the promise of stability. In the paddock behind the barn, Tempest grazed peacefully beside a pretty chestnut mare they had added to the herd. The stallion's wildness had been replaced by a calm strength that came from security rather than fear. He was everything Josephine had promised he could be, a horse who understood trust. Josephine stood at the paddock fence, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, watching the horses with contentment written in every line of her body. She wore a simple dress of green cotton, her hair loose around her shoulders, in a way she never would have dared when she first arrived. Back then she had tried to make herself invisible. Now she let herself be seen. Margaret emerged from the house carrying a basket of clean linens, moving with the brisk efficiency of a woman who knew every inch of her domain. She paused when she saw Josephine and smiled, the expression transforming her usually stern face into something warm and beautiful. "You should rest," she called. "Doctor said you need to take it easy in the early months." "I'm fine, Mother." The word still felt strange on her tongue, but good strange, like trying on a name that fit perfectly but was still being broken in. Margaret had asked her not to tell anyone else about their relationship, said it was enough that they knew, that they could build something new from this knowledge without needing to explain it to the world. Josephine had agreed, understanding that some truths were too precious to share widely, but in private she let herself say it. Mother. And each time Margaret's eyes would shine with tears she never quite shed. Silas rode up from the southern pasture, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust that glowed golden in the afternoon sun. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent his whole life in the saddle and walked toward Josephine with purpose in every step. He had changed too. The hard edges had softened. The constant tension in his shoulders had eased. He smiled more now, laughed sometimes, let himself hope. When he reached her, he did not speak, just wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head, looking out over the land his father had loved and he had nearly lost. "Beautiful day," he said quietly. "Every day is beautiful now. That's because you're here to see them." She turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of all the tomorrows they would share. When they pulled apart, she saw something in his face that made her heart skip. "What? I have something for you." He pulled a small box from his pocket, not wrapped, not fancy, just a plain wooden box worn smooth by what looked like years of handling. "This was my mother's," he said as he opened it. "My father gave it to her when they got engaged. She wore it every day until she died." Inside the box was a ring. Simple gold, no stone, just a band engraved with a pattern of leaves that caught the light and held it. "Josephine Hartley," he said, and his voice was steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "You came to this ranch carrying debts that were not yours and wearing guilt that belonged to other people. You saw through every wall I built. You loved me when I could not love myself. You taught me that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the bravest thing a person can do." He took her hand and she felt the ring slide onto her finger, cool metal warming against her skin. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that your trust was not misplaced? Will you build a family with me on this land that means nothing without you to share it?" She pulled him to his feet and kissed him with every ounce of love she possessed. "Yes," she whispered against his lips, "1,000 times yes." Behind them, Tempest nickered softly, and Josephine could have sworn the horse was smiling. The wedding was small, held in the meadow behind the ranch house on a day when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at directly. Wildflowers grew in profusion, and Margaret wove them into Josephine's hair with hands that trembled only slightly. The ranch hands gathered to witness, along with a few people from town who had come to respect the young couple who had saved a dying ranch through sheer force of will. The minister spoke words about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. But Josephine barely heard them. She was too focused on Silas, on the way he looked at her like she was the answer to questions he had not known how to ask. On the way, his hand held hers with a gentleness that made her want to cry. When he kissed her, sealing their vows, the assembled crowd cheered. Margaret cried into her apron. The sun blessed them with golden light that seemed to come from some divine source, turning the ordinary meadow into something holy. That night they stood on the porch of their home, wrapped in each other's arms, under a canopy of endless stars. Josephine thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss and loneliness, the years of wandering, the jobs that paid her wages but never fed her soul. Every hardship had been a stepping stone leading her to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Silas murmured against her hair. She smiled and pressed closer to his warmth. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am, for the pain that shaped me, for the road that led me here, for you." He tightened his arms around her. "I love you, Josephine Blackstone." The name sent a thrill through her heart. "I love you too, always." Somewhere in the darkness, Tempest called out to his mate, and the sound carried across the hills like a song of contentment. In the kitchen window, Margaret watched the young couple and allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She had orchestrated this, had brought these two broken souls together and given them the chance to heal each other. It was not manipulation, it was love. The fierce, protective love of a mother who would do anything to see her child happy. And in the small cemetery on the eastern ridge, the wind whispered through the grass around Jonathan Blackstone's grave. The headstone still read, "Betrayed, but not broken." But someone had added fresh flowers, yellow wild roses that grew only in the high meadows, a silent acknowledgement that some stories end not in bitterness, but in redemption. The ranch that had nearly been lost was saved. The debts that had threatened to destroy a family were erased. The lies that had poisoned relationships for years were finally exposed and discarded, and in their place grew something new, something built on truth and trust, and the kind of love that survives because it chooses to day after day in the small moments and the large. Josephine placed her hand over her belly, feeling the tiny flutter of life growing there. Their child. The next generation of Blackstones who would inherit not just land, but the legacy of people who chose forgiveness over revenge, who chose love over hate, who chose to build rather than destroy. In the vast Wyoming night, beneath a canopy of endless stars, two wounded souls who had found healing in each other began the greatest adventure of all. Not the adventure of conquest or accumulation, but the quiet, profound adventure of building a life together, of choosing each other every day, of transforming a place haunted by ghosts into a home filled with hope. And somewhere in the darkness, if you listened carefully, you could hear the sound of redemption. It sounded like laughter, like the wind through grass, like the steady beat of two hearts learning to trust again. It sounded like coming home.